The next speaker is Professor Joshua Plotkin, who is also the co-director of mathematical biology, Center for Mathematical Biology at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Joshua Plotkin graduated Harvard University with a top honor, and he received a PhD from Princeton University. And then he also visited Oxford University when he was still in early career. And then after that, he has been at the University of Pennsylvania for a long time. And now he's chaired professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And just like Professor Yoichiro Mori, Professor Plotkin is a professor of mathematics and biology at the same time. And he is a world prominent scholar in evolutionary biology and evolutionary ecology. And his research topics covers a very wide area. Today, Professor Plotkin is going to talk about a very, very interesting theme, measuring evolutionary forces of cultural change. Professor Plotkin, please.
One second. Okay, thank you very much, Matana-sensei, for the kind invitation and for setting up this collaboration between the University of Pennsylvania and Meiji University. I'm very honored to speak on the first of hopefully many collaborative symposia between MINS here at Meiji and between the Center for Mathematical Biology at the University of Pennsylvania. As you said, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm interested in the mathematics of evolutionary theory. And today I will talk about using evolutionary theory not to study organismal form, but rather to study human culture. I am not the first, not at all the first person to think about using evolutionary theory in this way to study human culture. These ideas actually arose with Charles Darwin. And therefore, to get us started this afternoon, I will share with you an evocative passage from Darwin's Descent of Man. So Darwin wrote in 1888 that there was, and I will just read this for you, a struggle for life is constantly going on amongst the words and grammatical forms in each language. The better, the shorter, the easier forms are constantly gaining the upper hand, and they owe their success to their own inherent virtue. And so we see here that Darwin viewed evolutionary theory very broadly, applicable to human culture, not just to biological form. And Darwin even described in the very next sentence, natural selection operating in the context of human culture. This passage, it turns out, is not actually Darwin's words, but this is a quote from the German linguist August Schleicher, who was a contemporary of Darwin's and who knew each other's work. And Schleicher, the linguist, was an early defender of evolutionary theory. Now, Schleicher has the honor of having published in the scientific literature the very first evolutionary tree or phylogenetic tree. And this is not a tree of different species, but a tree of the history of Indo-Germanic languages. Now they're called Indo-European languages. And this is the first tree that was really developed with principled scientific inference. Now, Darwin certainly saw this tree published. And when he saw it, he probably thought about his own phylogenetic tree, which he did not publish, but scribbled in his own notes much earlier in 1837. And if you compare these two trees, and I'm sure that Darwin compared these two trees, you will notice that the most obvious difference is that Darwin's tree has labels for the leaves, the nodes. but no labels on the internal nodes. Whereas Schleicher has labels, the names of the languages that exist today, but he also has labels for the internal nodes, for the languages that have gone extinct. And the reason why is that Schleicher had a huge advantage over Darwin. Schleicher actually knew those languages because they were written down in books and he could just observe them directly. So Schleicher had a complete fossil record, as it were, of all of the languages that have preceded him, whereas Darwin had this very incomplete and biased fossil record, which was a huge problem for biological evolutionary theory. I would think that Darwin might have been jealous of Schleicher's situation. And so comparing these trees and thinking about evolution applied to culture, we realize that culture provides an enormously rich set of data for us to think about how evolution proceeds. It is culture ubiquitously fossilizes itself in the form of libraries and books. We have complete histories of names, of words, of legal codes, histories of alliances and treaties and trade and wars between different nations that are kind of a complete fossil history of human culture, and provides us a way to study culture from an evolutionary perspective. And so today, my lecture today will be to take this analogy that Darwin raised in The Descent of Man very seriously. And I would like to apply the mathematics of evolutionary theory that was first developed for biological forms and for genetics. And I would like to apply the mathematics of evolutionary theory to culture specifically. So what I hope to do, and this is an ambitious outline, is to talk about three different aspects of culture. First, about language, which is what Darwin was describing. And second, I will talk about names and even dogs. And finally, I will talk about colors and words we use to describe colors. And finally, there I will discuss some of the Japanese specific results for colors. So I'll start with language. And I will discuss the evolution of past tense verbs in English. Now, you guys, since you've learned English as a second language, you now are all acutely aware of the problem with English, which is that there are many irregular past tense verbs, which you are forced to learn, I'm sure. However, if you had learned English 800 years ago, it would have been even harder for you because there were many more irregular verbs in Middle English than there are today. And over time, linguists like Steven Pinker have noticed, over time, irregular verbs tend to regularize. The regular past tense is ed. And so Middle English halt, which you don't know, has become modern English helped. And Middle English rot, which you probably don't know, is modern English reached. And clomb has become climbed. So irregular forms tend to regularize over time. This is the natural evolutionary progression in English. Now, what is causing this? Now, Steven Pinker has a very Darwinian view of this. The idea is that the regular form, ed, is just cognitively easier to remember and to learn. And these easier forms, just like Darwin wrote, these easier forms, by their own inherent virtue, have an advantage. And so they win out over time. So that's certainly, this is the standard linguistic theory, and that's certainly a plausible theory. But there are other possible theories. Another possible theory is that it has something to do with stochasticity and even diffusion. People have realized recently that stochasticity must play a role in language change because there's some stochastic chance as a learner when I'm a child in which forms I'm exposed to when I learn a language. And so there must be some randomness in what forms move and change frequency over time. And so to study this in detail, my collaborators and I worked with large corpora of English texts. These are actually modern American English texts that span 200 years. There are 400 million words in these texts, and they have been annotated to the part of speech. And that allows us to reconstruct time series of how the language is changing over a short time scale, just 200 years. And so, for example, we can look at the frequency of the regular and the irregular version of this word, dive. So I'm not sure with this audience. The verb dive in English has two different past tense forms. One is the regular form dived, ed, and one is the irregular form dove. Now, maybe when you learned English, I would love to know, who learned dove? Okay, and who learned dived? Okay, no one is wrong. Both types are acceptable, okay? But in fact, over the last 200 years, the frequency of dived has dived. Dove is slowly replacing dive. And in fact, there seems to be the irregular form is becoming more common and the regular form is going out. By the way, it's very important that we have a parsed corpus in order to reconstruct this time series. Because when we read the word D-O-V-E, in this parsed corpus, we know this is the simple past tense of the word dive. It is not the white bird that flies around the world and spreads peace. This is the past tense of the verb dive. In any case, we can reconstruct this time series and we can ask what is happening here. In fact, not just dived, dove, there are, it turns out, 36 polymorphic verbs in English that have two different past tense forms. One is the regular form, one is the irregular form, and they change frequency over the last 200 years. And you can just look at these data and see that there's certainly some stochasticity. So there's some diffusion going on, but there might also be some advection. There might be some natural selection for one form or the other. And so to address this seriously, we used the standard formula that looks at the advective force of selection, W, and that also looks at the diffusive force of randomness and transmission. This is called, unfortunately, it's called stochastic drift, that is 1 over n, and that was developed by Mutu Kimura. And we developed a method to infer these two parameters, W and n, from these time series data. And we also developed a way to test the hypothesis, is there any selection at all? Is W 0 or non-zero without knowledge of the value of n? So we can test this hypothesis. And when we applied these methods to the time series data in English, we found that there's many verbs are attributable to just stochastic drift, to diffusion. But other verbs are definitively under some sort of advection term. Some natural selection is operating on them, and I've highlighted them here in colors. In some cases, the verbs that are under selection are being selected for the regular form. So like smelt has become, it's almost extinct now. We say, I smelled that scent today. Wove is an irregular form that is being slowly replaced by weaved. It is still, weaved is still in the minority, but there is selection for the regular form. So this is in agreement with the classical linguistic theory that the regular form should win. But we also found many cases of selection for the irregular variant. And actually dived being replaced by dove is one such example, where there's definitively an advective force for dove. And the question is, this contravenes the standard linguistic theory. And the question is, what causes the selection for the irregular forms? And I cannot tell you the answer, but I can tell you some speculation and some stories. In particular, I believe in particular that dove started to replace dive because of the invention of automobiles in the United States. So automobiles were invented and became popular around 1920. And the frequency of the word drive became much more frequent in spoken and written English in 1920. Now, drive, you guys may know, drive is a strictly irregular verb. I drive, I drove. I drive, I drove. There's no drive in English. And so the frequency of the rhyming pattern, I've, of, increased rapidly in 1920. And so then when people started talking about diving, I dive, should I say I dive, or I dived, or I dove? And I said, I dive, I dove, because it rhymes with the increasing frequency of drive, drove. So this is an interesting story, but I think it's actually probably true, because in many cases, in all of the cases actually, where there's selection for the irregular variant, it is because there's a changing frequency of that rhyming pattern in the whole language, because different words are changing frequency. So for example, quit is replacing quitted, and this is the irregular form. And this is because there's an increase in the frequency of the word split in English over this time scale. Now, split also is a strictly irregular verb. The past tense of split is split. And so that rhyming pattern seems to be pulling the rest of the language to follow the same kind of rhyming pattern. In fact, in 11 out of 11 cases amongst these 36 verbs, in all the cases where the rhyming irregular past tense conjugation is increasing over time amongst the monomorphic verbs, there is the W, the selection, the advection force is favoring the irregular form of the polymorphic verb. So this does not happen by chance, that in all 11 out of 11 times, it's driven by rhyming, we believe. Okay, so I've told you a little bit about how language changes using and hiding some mathematics for how we reach these inferences. There are other areas of language change where we can also apply the same mathematical tools. So there's a lot of syntactical change in English and also in many other languages. Let me give you just one example. It has to do with the auxiliary verb do, which again, you guys were forced to learn when you learned English, this unusual verb do, the periphrastic do. So in English nowadays, we ask questions by saying, do they say? And we have imperatives saying, don't say that. But Shakespeare would have written, say they, and Shakespeare would have written, say not that. There has been an increase in the use of the auxiliary verb do, the weird word do, in English. This is known to linguists. It was known by Allegarde in the 50s already. The question is, what is causing this, and what is this chance, or is this natural selection? And so we collected a much larger corpus, going back all the way to Old English. And we looked at all of the sentences that do or do not have the auxiliary verb do, summing over all verbs, not just the verb say, all the verbs. And we looked at 4 types of grammatical sentences: the questions, the positive and negative questions, do you say, don't you say, and the imperatives, don't do that, and the declaratives, you don't do that. And what we found is interesting. There's sort of 2 patterns here. In the context of the question sentences, do you say and don't you say, that time series is completely consistent with stochasticity and diffusion alone. So just randomness is sufficient to explain the increase in the frequency of the verb do in the context of questions. However, once do was at high frequency in questions, very quickly there was very strong selection to also have do in the context of negative declaratives and imperative sentences, as if the language wants to have some sort of internal consistency. So we believe, and this is different from the typical linguist understanding of this history here, we believe that there's a mix of diffusion followed by advection that is causing these changes in English language, in syntax. Okay, so there's a lot more to do in language evolution. I think there's a lot more where evolutionary theory can help linguists to analyze and understand forces that are driving language change. And I will mention this very briefly, but I have no results. There's one of the most interesting things in language is not the written language, but actually how we speak, the sounds we make. And so Penn has collected an enormous data set of spoken sound, recordings of people speaking. Here's someone who says, what a winter that was. And the transcript is aligned with the audio waveform. And from this data, the linguists have extracted precise measurements of the location of the tongue, which correspond to the first and second modes of the power spectrum of the waveform. And they can precisely measure exactly how every vowel was pronounced in these very long recordings. This was the work of Bill Labov at the University of Pennsylvania. And it has been noticed that some of the vowels in English are changing their pronunciation over the course of about 120 years, and other vowels are very consistent. And if an ongoing project of mine is to have an evolutionary analysis of this problem and to really ask why and when do vowels change their sound and their pronunciation. This is a collaboration with the linguist Meredith Timinga at Penn. In any case, I want to turn to the second topic that I will discuss today, which is another cultural trait that is also fun to discuss, and this is first names. So I will discuss first names as a cultural trait and the evolution of first names. So we have a very large data set of first names in the United States. And when I got my hands on these data, the very first thing I looked at is the name Alice, because Alice is the name of my wife. And I found that Alice was, it turns out, one of the most popular female names in the United States around 1880. But then Alice took a real dive, and Alice was much less popular. And then my wife was born around here, and she was named Alice. And so I kind of feel that there was now, everyone else wanted to become Alice as well. So Alice is on the rise again. And so the question is, what types of cultural forces are driving these really dramatic changes in the frequency of names? And names, of course, are something that we care about. They are part of who we are. And they are part of who we name our children, what we think about our children. So it's not just the time series of Alice, but we have the time series for actually every birth in the United States. So we have 300 million births over the course, in this case, I looked at the most recent 80 years. And it is, as I said, a complete fossil record of this cultural trait. We have the entire population. And you can see over these timescales that there's very diverse patterns in the frequencies of different names. And the question is, what are the cultural forces that are driving that? And can we infer them using any sort of mathematical approach? So there's lots of things happening in these data. And I just want to mention a few interesting things before I tell you what we did. Some names like William and Daniel, Elizabeth, these names are kind of perennial favorites. They're always at high frequency. Other names show fashion cycles, boom, bust cycles. Okay, so my favorite is Brittany. Brittany in 1990, Brittany became very popular, and then it went out of fashion. Okay. Some other names that are trending today, like Emma. It turns out these names are actually part of intergenerational cycles, about 1 century cycles, and that these are people being named after their grandparents. And finally, there's other names that are interesting, like the name Maverick. So Maverick really took off in 1987. And so even in Japan, I feel like you guys may know why Maverick took off in 1987. So Maverick took off in 1987 because of Top Gun. In Top Gun, there's Tom Cruise, a famous movie actor, and he introduces himself to Kelly McGillis in the movie, and he says, "I'm Maverick." And then, of course, the very next year, 50 more Mavericks are born, and then the next year, 100 Mavericks are born, and then soon there's 1,000. Even today, we have more female Mavericks being born because of Tom Cruise. So these things happen in culture, which is actually very different from biology, but there can be kind of cultural broadcasts. Okay. In any case, what I want to do instead of studying these unusual cases is study most of the data and understand what is the general feature that drives these patterns in first names. What are the general laws that are driving name frequency dynamics? And the idea here is, instead of inferring a single fitness parameter W, like we did for 2 different verbs, we want to infer an entire function where the fitness of a name will depend upon its current frequency X. And so there's a whole function that's relating how frequent the name is today to how desirable it is to you as a parent when you want to choose the name for your child. So this is the function that we would like to infer from the time series data. And so to infer that, let me first mention that this idea of frequency-dependent fitness is very common in biology. It has been known for a long time. Haldane, JBS Haldane, realized that there's some genetic alleles that are definitely under negative frequency dependence, meaning that the more rare the type is, the more fit per capita it is. Now, the best example of this today is COVID strains. The more rare the COVID strain, the newer the COVID strain, it sees less immunity, and so it has a fitness advantage. In fact, this is what Haldane discussed, that pathogens types experience negative frequency dependent selection. The more rare type is fitter. There's, of course, also positive frequency dependence. This is actually very common in the context of mating signals in animals. If there's a mating signal, you kind of want to make sure that you have the type that everyone else has, that you can find a mate. But what I want to look at in names is kind of I don't know what kind of frequency dependence there is. So I would like to infer any non-parametric form of frequency dependence. And so we will at least assume that this relationship between the frequency of a type and the fitness of the name is piecewise constant, so we can make it a finite dimensional problem. And we will specify a model for how names change from one year to the next. And the basic idea of the model is a simple stochastic process where there's an exchangeable set of names. And what determines their desirability is only their current frequency, okay? And so the number of names of a certain type from year to year just follow a simple multinomial distribution where the desirability of a given name I depends upon this unknown function, the fitness as a function of its frequency. This is what we want to infer from the time series data, okay? So I'm trying to be polite, so I will not tell you how we did this, but we developed a method to infer this function w of x by maximum likelihood. The likelihood of the time series is actually a complicated expression, and it's not even convex, and we can still using some simple tricks, we can infer the best fit frequency dependent relationship from these named time series. And I will show you the results that we have when we infer it. So first of all, I'm going to show you how the fitness of a name is related to how the frequency of a name is related to its fitness or its growth rate. This is the neutral expectation. This is kind of a null model that says that whatever the frequency of a name, it's equally desirable. And certainly everyone, especially everyone who's a parent, knows this is false. I remember when my wife and I, when Alice and I chose the name of our firstborn son, we spent a long time choosing the name. We did not want to choose a name like Bob or Joe. These are really common names and they're boring. We don't want that name. Also, we did not want to choose a name that was too rare, because if it's too rare, then it's difficult to pronounce or something, then our poor son will have that unusual name forever. And I don't want that name either. So we wanted to choose the right frequency name. It turns out we chose the optimal name. I'll show you in a second. Because many years later, finally inferred the form of frequency dependence that applies to names in the United States. And this is the curve that we inferred. It is indeed non-monotonic. So the really common names are so common that they have negative fitness. So the really common names like Bob and Joe have a negative growth rate. And the really rare names also have a negative growth rate. But in the intermediate frequencies, there's a positive growth rate. And this explains some aspects of the name trajectory. So for example, here's Alice in 1895, the most common female name, and it has a negative growth rate as a result. A century later, Alice is, of course, less frequent, but now it has a positive growth rate, of course. And now around today, Alice is settling down at the stable equilibrium, which is about 1 in 1,000. That's basically the dividing point between undesirable and desirable names, okay? So I should say that the very low frequency names, we have not a lot of data on, and so they're very large confidence intervals. So I'm gonna focus on the names that are more frequent than 1 in 10⁴ from now on. This basic pattern of negative frequency dependence, that the rarer the name, the more desirable it is for the most part. This is true across many different countries and cultures. So we collected similar naming data for the United States, for the Netherlands, for France and Norway. These are countries that have very different population sizes, different languages. The names themselves are, of course, very different religions, different conventions about naming, and nonetheless, they all show fairly similar negative frequency dependence, that when a name becomes more common than 1 in 1,000, then the name is undesirable, okay? And this basic pattern for me, it's interesting to know. It also explains some things about the diversity of names. So what I'm showing here is, on the right, is the inverse cumulative probability distribution for the diversity of names. So the proportion for each frequency, the fraction of the names that are even more frequent than that. This has been studied a lot by demographers. And you can see that this frequency distribution has kind of 2 power laws. Now, this part of the power law, demographers have mostly ignored in the past, and they focused on the first power law. But it's striking that the kink in these two power laws occurs right around 1 in 1,000, which is precisely where names move from being desirable to being undesirable, which is why the frequency distribution is much more sharp after this kink. So the static distribution, abundance distribution of the names reflects something about the dynamic process by which names are changing frequency over time. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about different types of names. So different subpopulations of names. So we can infer the form of frequency dependence on different subpopulations. And we are guaranteed mathematically that our inference will have the feature that the weighted average will agree with the inference for all of the names. And so the very first pair of populations we looked at are the male and the female names. And we found this kind of surprising, actually impossible result, that in every single frequency class, the extant, the existing male names have a higher growth rate than the female names. Now, this is impossible because it would predict that the sex ratio in the United States will become all men. But of course, the sex ratio is fixed at 1 to 1. So what is actually happening here is that there's another parameter we infer that I did not tell you about. This is a mutation, the innovation rate. It's the rate of inventing a brand new name. This is just the selection pressure on the existing names. And so, in fact, we also infer that females have a higher innovation rate in the United States than males. And the difference in the innovation rate is exactly the difference in the offset between these two curves here. What I'm trying to say is that there is a much greater diversity of female names in the United States. This is known. And we can understand now that that is due to, it's not due to differential rates of copying rare names. It's due to actually the fact that parents like to invent new names more for females than for daughters than they do for sons. Okay, so let me look at one other subpopulation of names. These are Bible names and non-Bible names. So by Bible names, I mean names that occur in the Judeo-Christian Bible. So the famous Bible names are like John and Luke and David and Mary and so on. And I thought that maybe Bible names would have an advantage because the United States is largely a Judeo-Christian society and Bible has some sort of resonance with a lot of people. And so again, we separately analyzed the form of frequency dependence in the Bible names and all the other names, the non-Bible names. And we find kind of two results here. First of all, even within Bible names, basically the same form of negative frequency dependence holds. That the really common Bible names like John and David actually have negative fitness and they're going downhill. The more rare Bible names like Ezekiel and Gabriel, these are the best names. They are rare and they're biblical, okay? That's one result. The other result, of course, is that in any given frequency class, the Bible name has a much higher fitness than the non-Bible names. And in particular, if you just look at the graph here, biblical Bible names enjoy an advantage of about 2.5% in the growth rate, okay? Whereas the most rare names have about a 3.5% growth rate advantage over the most common names. So I've always wanted to do this. We can compare finally these two very different effects on human culture. One is the effect of religion and history and the reason why Bible names are advantageous is due to religion and just the simple fact that some names were written in the Bible. And that has about a 2.5% effect. And there's also this popularity effect that if you choose a more rare name, then that's more desirable, can be as much as 3.5% effect. So we're comparing and quantifying these two fundamentally different forces on human culture, the force of religion and the force of fashion. And it turns out they're actually kind of comparable in magnitude. Religion is thankfully a little bit less strong. Okay, I want to turn now to another trait, which is dog breeds, which is also a cultural trait. I want to talk about the evolution of dog breeds. Now, in the United States, people are crazy about buying dogs and also cats. And actually, I was in the mall right here. And I saw also some amazing pet stores. So I can see in Japan, people are also crazy about buying dogs. Here we have from the American Kennel Club, a data set of 65 million registered dogs. These are purebred dogs, registered by pet owners between the years 1925 and 2005, okay? And we can see the trajectories of different dog breeds. And so, for example, the Greyhound was the most popular, almost the most popular dog in 1940, but then it came a huge crash and no one wants the Greyhound anymore. Whereas the Rottweiler was very rare, and now all of a sudden the Rottweiler is becoming almost the most popular dog and just recently is dying off, okay? So the question is, what form of selection, frequency-dependent selection is driving these patterns, okay, in dogs? We can, of course, apply the exact same machinery to infer the best fit frequency-dependent curve. And indeed, we find that there's, for the most part, negative frequency dependence. The rare dog, you really want to buy the rarer dog, okay? The rare dog is the exciting dog to buy. How much more exciting is it? It's about 15% better, okay? That's what I'm trying to say here. Or yeah, the rare dog has about a 15% advantage over the most common dog, or 16%. And so it's nice to know that, but there's something very unsatisfying about this model, because if you think about it, this model we've specified is exchangeable. So we can permute the labels of the dogs, right? And the fitness should depend only on the frequency. So this model cannot possibly produce this fashion cycles in dogs. In fact, we've drawn this inference here, but if we actually simulate, for example, this model, it produces trajectories that don't look anything like the dogs. They don't show any fashion cycles, boom and bust. And this is because to produce a boom and a bust, you have to have two different fitnesses for the same frequency. You have to have a positive fitness on the way up, and then as you're falling, you have to have a negative fitness at the same frequency on the way down. So our model does not have that. We have one fitness for each frequency. So somehow our model is misspecified relative to the actual process that's generating the cycles in dogs. And the right model is actually a novelty bias model. So it's a very simple model that's similar, but it seems similar, but it's very different. We have a different model where the idea is a new dog breed is invented. Let's say there's a mutation rate, and the newest dog breed has a certain advantage plus delta W over the most recent dog breed. It's a very simple model. And this, we can fit the parameters of that model. In fact, the way we fit it is by matching the average frequency dependence of fitness in the real data. And that model can then produce the types of trajectories, at least in the right kind of timescales that are observed in the real data. So this is a problem that this conflation between rarity selection and novelty selection, this is actually a problem that even Haldane had when he discussed the advantage of rare pathogens. In fact, pathogens do not have an advantage from being rare. They have an advantage from being novel. So, for example, if we brought to Japan a very large amount of a new COVID strain, that strain would have a huge advantage in Japan. Even if it has a high frequency, it's because it's novel that it has an advantage. And so there's this fundamental distinction between these two types of models. And these types of patterns cannot be produced by Markov models, the Markov 1 models. In any case, I want to finally turn to the last topic that I'm going to discuss today, which is, again, another aspect of culture and cultural change, which has to do with colors and words as well. And so this is actually a famous topic that has been studied by scientists for decades. And the question is, what word do we use to describe each different color? And this is a problem in compression, right? Because we don't have as many words. There's an infinite number of colors, but we only have a small number of words. And so there is a pair of scientists, Berlin and Kay, who starting in the late 60s and then 70s, embarked on a terrific and amazing project called the World Color Survey, where they went and interviewed speakers of 130 different languages. Most of the languages are pre-industrial communities. Some of the languages are industrial communities. And they brought the exact same set of stimuli, these 330 colors, and the experiment is very simple. They ask a speaker, what is the name for this color? 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 And they record how often the speakers utter different words, okay? That's actually half of the experiment, okay? And that allows us to construct color maps that are shown here for two different languages. The first is the language Vagla, which is spoken in Ghana in Africa. And the second is Matuwangaku, which is spoken in Australia. So these two languages, they each have 6 major color terms, okay? The languages are on different sides of the planet. They have there's no evolutionary history between these two languages. And nonetheless, the speakers of these languages divide color space up in very similar ways. This was the observation of Berlin and Kay. And this is actually generally true. For languages with a given number of color terms, like 6 or 7 or 8, most of the languages will have the same partitioning of color space into words. Of course, the words are different in the languages, but the same partitioning. So why is that? Why is that? This has been the topic of a lot of research, and the basic idea is that the basic reason why, of course, is because all humans have the same trichromatic photoreceptors. So the psychophysics of perception are, for the most part, what explains why languages divide colors into the same partitioning. And in particular, the basic idea is that it has been measured, a perceptually uniform metric has been measured on color space that tells you how far apart two different colors are, such that they are noticeably different, just noticeably different from one another. This is common across all humans, in fact, even also many pattern primates. And the theory posits that languages are sort of rate distortion optimal. Given the vocabulary size, how much distortion the language is allowed to have, they partition the color space up in a way that is most efficient, that will increase the rate of information transfer when you're only allowed to utter a word and you'd like to instead communicate an actual color. And there's a way to constructively solve for the best partitioning for a given degree of distortion. This is classically known. So that's most of the story. But my postdoc Colin Twomey and I thought there must be more to the story, because it also depends how much we want to talk about different colors, right? So different colors in different communities may have different communicative needs. Maybe I want to talk about this color more than I want to talk about that color.
Make sure.
Yes.
So, please suppose they have, physiologically same retina.
Yeah, we don't suppose it, we can prove it. Yeah.
They can recognize, say, for example, blue.
Yeah, well, so they can, people from all of these different language communities have been assayed on the psychophysics of perception. When do you notice that the color has changed? They show you 2 colors on a screen, and everyone has the same, empirically, has the same psychophysics of perception. And that is because we have almost identical rods and cones, right? So our perception is uniform across the globe. In fact, even primates have very similar perception. They can recognize equally well when 2 colors are different, and that is this Bregman divergence, D. This has been measured, okay? So we know this is true. But different communities may have different desires to talk about different colors, and presumably if your community wants to talk about a certain region of color space efficiently, then you will have more divisions, more partitioning of that region of color space, right? So Colin Twomey developed a method to predict the rate distortion optimal language given the known metric of perceptual distance, but also given some distribution over color space of how often we want to mention each color, okay? And then we can predict, actually better than before, we can predict the partitioning of each of these languages de novo. And we get better predictions than assuming that there's uniformity of needs, okay? Now, however, given the actual languages, we can also solve an inverse problem, right? we can say, given that, assuming that these languages are rate distortion optimal, and knowing the perceptual distance metric, we can solve the inverse problem and ask what must be the underlying need to speak about each color in a given language. And so that allowed us to infer the following communicative needs. So here are these two languages, Ghana and in Australia. And we can see that these languages actually have fairly similar needs. They both want to talk in yellow. They both want to talk a lot about the yellows and the reds, and a little bit these bright blues. They don't want to talk about these dark blues, and they don't want to talk about these dark browns. Okay, that's the need. So we can make this inverse inference for every different language. And I'm going to show you the average need across colors, averaged across all of the languages of all 130 languages in the study. And the basic pattern is that there's a very strong desire to talk about the warm colors, like especially the yellows and the reds and the pinks. These warm colors, there's in fact, 30-fold more need to discuss them than the really cool colors, like the browns and the dark blues and so on. Okay, so this is the global average pattern. This is what we inferred. And then we have to ask ourselves, does this inference make any sense? Is it plausible? Okay, do you believe it? So we looked at another data set to check to see if it makes any sense. This is a data set that other scientists had collected. This is a data set on the coloration of fruits in the Kibale forest in Uganda. These are fruits that are eaten by pattern primates that have the same trichromatic color vision that humans do. And you'll notice that the fruits, when the fruits are unripe, they are colored like dark brown and dark yellow. These are regions of very low color band. And as they become mid-ripe, and then especially when they become actually ripe, the fruit coloration takes on the reds and the bright yellows that we had inferred in humans are the most important demands. So, of course, we're not proposing that languages are designed to talk about fruits. It's the other way around. The fruits have evolved their morphology and their coloration to match the sensory desires and the most salient colors of the primates that act as their dispersers, right? So this is advantageous to the fruits. So this makes me feel like this inference is reasonable, okay? And there's also other data to support this. Okay, so this is the global average of which colors we want to talk about. But of course, there's lots of variation. So here, I'm just going to show you some cross-cultural variation. So here are two different languages that have very different needs. So Guarani, which is spoken in Ecuador, well, maybe I should start with Matawangapu, which you've already seen in Australia, has a lot of need to talk about these yellows and especially some light greens and reds. Whereas Guarani has almost no need to talk about those greens. So it has very different variation. And actually, I'm circling here in blue, these are the regions that are significantly less need than the cross-language average. And in red are the colors that are more need than the cross-language average. And there's a big cultural difference. So these two language communities have different needs for communicating about colors. And so the question remains, so what explains this cross-cultural variation? Why do some cultures want to talk about some colors more than others? And so we can explain some of this variation by the local ecology, the actual landscape colors associated with where these languages are spoken. But that's only a small amount of the variation. Most of the variation remains unexplained. And there's lots of hypotheses. It may have to do with what types of objects are economically valuable in different cultures. And you want to be able to describe this object, or what types of customs are used in different cultures. So there's a lot of research to be done here now that we can infer the needs for each different culture. So finally, in my last few minutes, I will finally talk about Japanese. On the flight over, and the long flight from Philadelphia to Haneda, I looked at our own data set, and I thought, I should look at the Japanese needs so that I can meet the Japanese needs. And so I will talk about Japanese colors finally. There's actually a wonderful study by Kuriki et al. That repeated the original Berlin and Kay study but with a larger subject pool. So we have even better data for Japanese than most other languages. Japanese has 18 major color words, and actually it's very similar to English. English has about 18 or 19, okay? These are words that you guys probably know, okay? And that is the color map for the 18 words, except for black and white. And so we also have inferred the needs for Japanese speakers, and here are the needs. And so, like most industrial countries, Japanese needs are more uniform. They want to talk about all the colors, but there's still some variation. They're more uniform than Warani, but there's still like fivefold variation. And then I can finally tell you what are the difference between the Japanese needs and the average needs of most languages. And so I will highlight finally the difference between the Japanese needs for each color and the average needs for every color across the world. And some regions are less need in blue. These colors, the Japanese don't want to talk about so much. This kind of dark brown and very dark green, and I don't know what this color is even called. There are other regions, and these are very interesting. There are other regions where the Japanese have much higher need, significantly higher need than the global average. These regions here, this color here, these regions here, this color that is probably hada, there's more need to talk about that kind of color in Japanese than most languages. And also these colors here, which is probably odo, has more need than most other languages. Now, actually, English also has elevated needs here. So this is not unique to Japanese. English also has more need than the average here. But these three regions here, these are unique to Japan. And I don't understand them. Maybe you can tell me. This one is very unusual. The extra need to talk about these dark blues. Usually the cool colors are not desirable to discuss. But in Japanese, these have much higher need than the global average. And you have an entire word for this, kon. We have no cognate word in English, no single word that really describes these colors. So I don't know why the Japanese are interested in kon, but they are. This particular color chip is also very interesting. There's a significantly higher need for this color. And this color is misa. And again, in English, there's no major word to describe that color. But in Japanese, there's a whole word just for this one color. I don't know why. Maybe you can tell me why. And finally, this is for me the most delightful one. This set of colors, which is kind of like a green-yellow, has extra need in Japanese and not in English. And you have a whole word. These colors, the word that was elicited in the Japanese speakers was matcha. So maybe it's because of matcha. I don't know. There's more need to speak about these particular kind of green-yellows in Japanese than in most languages in the world. And they have actually produced particular terms in Japanese that have no cognates in most other languages. So I think there's lots to be learned in this kind of analysis. In fact, I myself look forward to enjoying some of these particular Japanese needs like matcha over the next week. So I'm very happy to be here in Japan. So with that, I want to thank all of the people who have contributed to this research. Most importantly, I want to thank my graduate student, Mitchell Newberry, who really did almost all of the work that I just presented to you on names and on words. As well as we had collaborators in linguistics at Penn, Robin Clark and Chris Ahern, who are experts in the corpuses that have been annotated. And even an undergraduate who worked in my lab, Allison Feeder, she's now an assistant professor at University of Washington, helped develop this hypothesis test from the Kimura model based on a time series data. And finally, this most recent work on color was run by Colin Twomey, a postdoc of mine, and is in collaboration with David Brainerd, who's a psychologist who studies the psychophysics of perception. So with that, I want to thank you for all of your attention and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments?
Just one question. So in the first part of the language evolution, you mentioned that the word dive was changed to drove, though because at that time there was quite a lot much drivers
Right.
in there. Then for one question is that what happens for the drive and drove? Is there any information about that?
The word drove does not exist.
Drove.
The free drive, so drive is a strictly irregular verb. It's only drive, drove. The frequency, the overall frequency of that word increased about twofold starting around 1920. But there's no alternative, there's no regular, the word drive does not exist in English. It's not observed in any book. Okay, but the overall frequency of the word of any tense, drive, drove, driven, those words increased by about twofold around 1920. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Right.
Yes.
Can I ask one question about the evolution of languages you introduced us? So I'm not quite sure about the nowadays number of English-speaking people or number of communication by English is rapidly increasing.
Yeah.
So there may be much more chance to kind of a stochastic process occurs. So can you observe such kind of acceleration of these kind of changes because within, say, something like these 5 years, 50 years or something, or even 20 years?
Yeah. So we have done two things that address that. We have interesting data in the United States and in Canada. So every year every 5 years there's a census in Canada. And one of the questions is, what language do you speak in your house? And you're right, of course, that there's pressure, there's positive frequency dependence. There's pressure to speak the dominant language. So immigrants to Canada, initially they might speak their native tongue, but their children will speak English in their house. So you're right, there's often pressure, positive frequency dependence in what language you speak. Okay, that's one thing. But you also asked, like, is there some change in the amount of stochasticity because there are more speakers? And the answer is probably no. So I didn't show you this, but the question is, what determines the diffusion constant for a word? Is it the number of speakers or the frequency of the, and I don't think it has anything to do with the number of speakers. So here I'm actually showing you the frequency of these different verbs. So some verbs like know are really frequent, they're common verbs, and other verbs like knit. This is to knit a sweater or to dream. These are less common words. And the overall frequency of the word is what determines the strength of diffusion. So like the really common words have a very large N, which is the inverse of the diffusion constant. So these words have much less stochasticity associated with them, which makes a lot of sense. Yeah, but it's not the number of speakers. It's the relative frequency of that word compared to other words in the language.
There is one question from the viewer who is anonymous, and about the reference by Darwin, the descent of man.
Yeah.
And in your slide, it was shown to be published in 1888, and this person is asking if wasn't it published in 1871. So maybe you can check it later.
Well, my anonymous friend I would like to email my anonymous friend at some point. It's possible, in fact, that it was only in, I hope this is true, that only in the later version did Darwin include this passage, because the Descent of Man was published several times. And actually, that passage is not written by Darwin. It is a direct quote. It is, in fact, it's very interesting. That quote is not even from August Schleicher's book. That quote is written by a linguist called Max Mueller, who published a review, a book review of August Schleicher's book called The Science of, something like The Science of Language from the Evolutionary Perspective. The book was published, and then Max Mueller published a review of that book in the very first issue of the journal Nature. Okay, so that quote occurred in the very first issue of the journal Nature, and then Darwin read it, and he may have incorporated it in subsequent editions of The Descent of Man, because in fact, Darwin saw a lot of advantage in collaborating with linguists, because it was very easy to convince people about the idea of descent with modification in the context of language, because we had all of the extinct languages. And it was, of course, much harder to convince the skeptical public about descent with modification from apes. That was very hard for people to understand or believe. So Darwin has a close collaboration with linguists and used linguists and linguistics to kind of convince the public about the reality of evolution. So it's possible, I hope, that that this quote only came from the 1888 version. But
Okay. Thank you very much. So you are talking about one of the editions of his book that was relevant in this context.
I hope so.
Okay, thank you very much. And talking about this dark blue cone, in Japan, there is a tradition of sort of clothes and other things. So in some areas where they produced this color based on fermented kind of some plants, they were very rich because it was very popular tradition in Japan.
How long ago?
It was during Edo period,
okay.
or
So
late Edo periods at least.
Yeah, that is consistent with some hypotheses about other languages that have needs for certain words because they became economically very important, like the invention of indigo dye. In Europe, it became associated with certain languages that emphasize those colors and have words specifically for that color. But the word probably did not exist before the economic invention.
I see. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so once again, let's thank Professor Plotkin for his wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.